The wrench slipped from Ava Morgan's grease-stained fingers as another helicopter lifted off from Grayson Forward Airstrip, its rotor blades cutting through the Nevada desert heat like a knife through her dreams. She stood in the shadow of Hangar 7, watching Lieutenant Marcus Webb climb into the cockpit of a EA-60 Blackhawk that she could fly better than him in her sleep. 29 years old, certified aviation mechanic, and the woman they refused to trust with wings. "Back to work, Morgan," Staff Sergeant Rick Coleman called out, his voice carrying the casual dismissal she'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. "Those engines won't fix themselves." Ava picked up her wrench and returned to the F-16 Fighting Falcon's engine compartment, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. She'd graduated top of her class from flight school with perfect simulation scores and instructor recommendations that should have fast-tracked her straight to active duty. Instead, she spent her days elbow-deep in aircraft maintenance while lesser pilots took to the skies and machines she understood better than anyone on this base. The red flag in her personnel file followed her everywhere like a shadow. Insubordination, it read. Refused to step down from unauthorized test flight, November 2019. The incident that had destroyed her career before it truly began. She remembered that day with painful clarity. Captain Bradley Hayes had been preparing for routine training exercises when she'd noticed the altimeter calibration readings were off by several degrees. She'd approached him respectfully, professionally, with the technical manual in hand and the exact specifications highlighted in yellow marker. "Captain Hayes, sir, I need to show you something important about your altimeter settings." He'd looked up from his pre-flight checklist with the expression of a man being interrupted by a child. "What is it, Morgan?" "The calibration is incorrect. These readings could send you into a fatal descent pattern during your approach sequence." Hayes had laughed, actually laughed, before waving her away with a dismissive gesture. "Stick to your wrenches, Morgan. Leave the flying to the professionals." 20 minutes later, his bird nearly augured into the desert floor when the faulty readings sent him into exactly the descent pattern she'd warned him about. Only emergency protocols and sheer luck had saved his life. Instead of gratitude or recognition, Ava had been grounded indefinitely and transferred to permanent maintenance duty. "You're smart, Morgan," they'd said during her last performance review. "Damn smart. But flying combat missions? That's not in your lane. Never will be." She'd never argued back, never raised her voice, never filed complaints. But she'd never stopped training either. Every morning at 5, before the base stirred to life, she ran simulator programs on outdated equipment in the maintenance hangar. She practiced emergency procedures, memorized radio protocols, and flew virtual missions until her eyes burned and her hands cramped from gripping the controls. The other mechanics thought she was obsessed. The pilots thought she was delusional. Morgan's still playing pilot. She'd heard Lieutenant Webb joke to Coleman last week. Someone should tell her the fantasy ends here. Every whisper, every snicker, every casual dismissal of her abilities cut deeper than the last. But deep down, in the part of her soul that aviation fuel couldn't wash away, Ava Morgan knew she was born to fly. The cockpit called to her like gravity itself, relentless and undeniable. She just needed one chance to prove it. As she tightened the bolt on the engine housing, the radio crackled to life with routine communications. "Tower to Blackhawk 77. You're cleared for training exercises. Acknowledge." Blackhawk 77 acknowledged, Webb's voice coming through clear and confident. Beginning approach to target zone Alpha. Ava paused in her work, listening to the familiar rhythm of flight operations. Somewhere above the desert, pilots were living the life she'd trained for, the life she'd earned, the life they'd stolen from her with a single red flag in her file. But she kept working, kept training, kept believing that someday, somehow, She'd get her chance to show them what she was truly capable of. That chance was coming sooner than anyone expected, and when it arrived, she'd be ready. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as she returned to her maintenance work, unaware that in just a few hours, an emergency would change everything. An emergency that would finally give her the opportunity to prove that skill transcends politics. That courage speaks louder than doubt, and that sometimes the most qualified person is the one everyone overlooks. The wrench felt heavy in her hand as she tightened another bolt, but her flight helmet hung pristine in her maintenance locker, waiting for the moment when she'd finally be allowed to use it. The alarm pierced through the desert air like a scream, jolting Ava from her routine maintenance work on the F-16's hydraulic system. Emergency sirens meant only one thing at Grayson Forward Airstrip. Someone was in serious trouble. She dropped her tools and rushed toward the communication center, where voices crackled through radio static with increasing urgency. The training exercise had gone catastrophically wrong. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Lieutenant Webb's voice broke through the speakers, thick with panic and barely controlled terror. "We're going down. Primary pilot incapacitated." "I can't hold her steady." Ava's blood ran cold. Coleman and Webb had taken off in Black Hawk 77 less than an hour ago for what should have been a routine live-fire evacuation drill. Clear skies, perfect visibility, controlled environment with predetermined coordinates and simulated casualties positioned 15 miles northeast of base. But intelligence had missed something critical. A hostile cell was operating in the area, and they just opened fire on an American aircraft with real bullets. "Ground control, this is Black Hawk 77. Webb's voice cracked again. Coleman took shrapnel to the shoulder and chest. Blood everywhere. The bird's spinning. "I'm losing control." The tower erupted into chaos. Officers scrambled for solutions that didn't exist. Captain Rodriguez, their most experienced pilot, was 30 minutes out returning from a supply run to Nellis Air Force Base. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours with wounded soldiers bleeding in the desert and a recon team taking heavy fire below. "We need another bird airborne in 5 minutes maximum," someone shouted into their headset. "The ready bird is fueled and systems checked," another voice replied. "But Rodriguez is our only qualified pilot available." Ava stood frozen in the doorway, listening to the desperation in their voices. She knew that a 60 Black Hawk sitting on the tarmac better than anyone. She'd maintained every system, calibrated every instrument, run diagnostics on every component. That aircraft was her responsibility, her pride, her connection to the sky she'd been denied. 30 minutes, Lieutenant Morrison muttered from the communications desk. "We'll lose the entire recon team." Through the static, they could hear gunfire in the background of Webb's transmissions. Real combat, real casualties, real soldiers, dying while the base scrambled for options they didn't have. That's when Ava made her decision. She walked calmly to her maintenance locker and retrieved her flight helmet. Regulation required all personnel to have one, even ground crew. She'd kept hers pristine, polished, and ready for 3 years, hoping against hope for exactly this moment. "Morgan, where are you going?" called out Bobby Thompson, the technician working beside her earlier. She didn't answer. Her boots echoed across the tarmac as she approached the ready bird, helmet tucked under her arm. The Black Hawk sat waiting, rotors folded, systems ready, like a racehorse eager to run. "Morgan, you're not cleared for flight operations, Lieutenant." Morrison shouted from the tower. "Stand down immediately." Ava paused at the aircraft's side door, looking up at the tower where faces pressed against the glass. She could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation, the knowledge that they were about to lose American soldiers because of bureaucracy and red tape. "Then you take her up," she said calmly, climbing into the pilot's seat. No one moved to stop her. They couldn't. They needed a miracle, and she was the only one offering to provide it. The Black Hawk's engine spun up with a familiar whine that sent electricity through her veins. Every switch, every gauge, every control felt like an extension of her own nervous system. She'd flown this exact sequence 1,000 times in simulators, but now, with real lives hanging in the balance, it felt different. It felt like coming home. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over as 3 years of suppressed training kicked in. Pre-flight checks completed in under 90 seconds. Everything green, everything. Ready. Tower. This is Black Hawk 77 requesting immediate clearance for emergency evacuation. Silence stretched across the radio for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, a voice she didn't recognize. "Morgan, you're cleared for takeoff. God help us all." The helicopter lifted off the tarmac, smooth as silk, no hesitation, no wobble, rising into the desert sky like she'd done it 100 times under combat conditions. Through her headset, she could hear the collective intake of breath from the ground crew watching her departure. As the base fell away beneath her, Ava felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The pure, undiluted joy of flight. But there was no time to savor it. Somewhere ahead, American soldiers were bleeding in the sand, and she was their only hope for survival. The radio crackled with coordinates and tactical updates as she locked in the navigation system. Her fingers danced across the controls with surgical precision, years of suppressed skill finally unleashed. She was flying toward the sound of gunfire, toward the chance she'd been waiting for her entire career. The chance to prove that the woman they wouldn't let fly was exactly the pilot they needed. The Devil's Canyon stretched below like a scar. Across the Nevada desert, its rocky walls hiding deadly secrets that intelligence had missed. Ava pushed the Black Hawk through turbulent air, her hands steady on the controls as radio chatter filled her helmet with increasingly desperate updates. Black Hawk 77, this is Recon Team Alpha. A voice crackled through the static, tight with pain and barely controlled panic. We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. 2 wounded, 1 critical. We need immediate extraction. Copy that, Alpha, Ava replied, her voice calm as steel despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I have your position marked. 80-90 seconds. Mark smoke if you can. Who is this? Sergeant Michael Torres, the team leader, asked through gritted teeth. Where's Coleman? Where's Command? Command's watching from below, she said, bringing the bird low through the canyon. Coleman's down. I'm not. The canyon walls rose around her like the jaws of some prehistoric beast, wind shear threatening to slam her aircraft into the rocks. Below, muzzle flashes sparked like deadly fireflies against the brown stone. The recon team was pinned behind. A cluster of boulders, enemy positions dug in on 3 sides with overlapping fields of fire. Hot LZ, came the warning from below. Multiple hostiles, automatic weapons, elevated positions on the ridgeline. Ava had trained for this exact scenario during those early morning simulator sessions that everyone had mocked. She put the Black Hawk into a tactical approach, fast and low, using the canyon's natural contours to mask her approach from the enemy gunners. Tracer rounds lit up the sky around her aircraft like angry hornets seeking their target. She could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the rotor blades, but her hands remained steady on the controls. 3 years of suppressed training had prepared her for this moment. 30 seconds out, she announced, scanning the landing zone for the best approach angle. Crew chief, prepare for rapid extraction. Sergeant Martinez, the crew chief who'd worked with her on countless maintenance calls, moved to the cargo door. He'd seen her work, seen her dedication, even if command had refused to acknowledge her capabilities. Roger that, Martinez replied. Ready for pickup. The rotor wash kicked up a blinding sandstorm as Ava brought the aircraft into a perfect hover, the skids kissing the ground for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for the wounded to scramble aboard, short enough to minimize their exposure to enemy fire. "Load them up, fast and clean," Martinez shouted over the rotor noise. 4 soldiers hauled themselves and their wounded comrades into the cargo bay. Blood stained the metal deck, but everyone was breathing. Everyone was alive. "We're loaded," Martinez called out. "Get us out of here." Ava pulled pitch and lifted off, climbing rapidly out of the canyon while enemy fire chased them toward the ridgeline. In the back, she could hear one of the wounded soldiers speaking through his pain. "Holy hell," he gasped, pressing a field. Dressing to his leg wound. "Who are you?" "Someone they wouldn't let fly," she replied through the intercom. The flight back to base was smooth and professional, but Ava's mind was already racing ahead to what would happen when they landed. She just violated every regulation in the book, commandeered a military aircraft without authorization, and flown a combat mission she wasn't cleared for. But 4 American soldiers were alive because of it. "Black Hawk 7-7, you're cleared for immediate landing. Pad 3, medical standing by," the tower radioed. "Copy that, tower. Black Hawk 7-7 inbound, 4 wounded, 2 urgent surgical." She set the aircraft down with the gentleness of a feather touching water, her movements precise and controlled, despite the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished. The wounded were offloaded and rushing toward the medical facility within 30 seconds. As the rotor blades spun down, Ava sat in the pilot's seat, hands still gripping the controls, adrenaline finally beginning to fade from her system. Through the windscreen, she could see a crowd gathering on the landing pad. Officers, enlisted personnel, ground crew, pilots, everyone who'd monitored the mission over radio. Captain Rodriguez, the pilot who'd been 30 minutes out, stood at the edge of the crowd. He'd landed just as she was touching down with the wounded, and his expression was unreadable. She climbed out of the cockpit, expecting handcuffs, expecting arrest, expecting the end of her military career. Instead, she found something she'd never experienced before: respect. The silence on the landing pad was heavier than applause, more profound than any ceremony. These were people who understood what they just witnessed: impossible flying under impossible circumstances, performed by the woman they'd refused to trust with wings. But she also knew that the real battle was just beginning. Command would launch an inquiry, and all the skill in the world wouldn't save her from the bureaucratic storm that was coming. They'd call it unauthorized pilot utilization. In a combat zone, and the paperwork was probably already being prepared to end her career once and for all. The question was, would saving 4 lives be enough to outweigh 3 years of institutional prejudice? She was about to find out. The sterile conference room smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic dread. Ava sat ramrod straight in her chair, hands folded in her lap, as Colonel David Anderson shuffled through the stack of papers that would determine her fate. The inquiry had been called for 0800 hours, less than 12 hours after she'd touched down with 4 wounded soldiers. Unauthorized pilot utilization in a combat zone. Anderson read from the official report, his voice carrying the weight of military justice. Violation of direct orders from a superior officer. Commandeering of military aircraft without proper clearance. Across the table, Captain Bradley Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The same Hayes who'd dismissed her concerns about altimeter calibration 3 years ago, who'd nearly died because of his arrogance, who'd been instrumental in keeping her grounded ever since. "The regulations are clear," Hayes interjected, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension. Morgan acted outside the chain of command. She put military assets at risk with her reckless behavior. Reckless behavior. Ava spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice quiet but steady. 4 soldiers are alive because of that reckless behavior. That's not the point, Hayes snapped. You had no authorization, no clearance, no right to take that aircraft. What if you'd crashed? What if you'd been shot down? We'd have lost the helicopter and the rescue team. Colonel Anderson raised his hand for silence. The preliminary investigation will determine the facts. Morgan, you understand the severity of these charges? Yes, sir. Your actions, while potentially life-saving, violated multiple regulations and directly disobeyed orders from Lieutenant Morrison. The maximum penalty for unauthorized aircraft operation in a combat zone is court-martial and dismissal from service. Ava felt the walls closing in around her. She'd known this moment would come, but hearing it stated so clinically made her stomach clench with fear. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd trained for, was about to be destroyed by the same bureaucracy that had kept her grounded in the first place. However, Anderson continued, I've received some interesting documentation that complicates this matter considerably. He pulled out a folder that Ava hadn't seen before. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the recon team leader you extracted yesterday, dictated his after-action report from his hospital bed while nurses were still stitching shrapnel wounds in his arms. The colonel began to read, Flight executed with perfect control under direct enemy fire. Pilot demonstrated exceptional skill, tactical awareness, and life-saving decision-making under extreme duress. Recommend immediate upgrade to active cockpit status with full combat authorization. Hayes' face reddened. Sir, with respect, ground personnel don't have the authority to make pilot recommendations. Perhaps not, Anderson agreed. But I also have a report from Captain Rodriguez, who observed the landing and spoke with the crew chief immediately after the mission. He pulled out another document. Pilot Morgan's actions represent the highest standards of military aviation. Her technical proficiency, situational awareness, and crew resource management exceeded that of pilots with 10 times her logged hours. Recommend full flight status immediately. Rodriguez wasn't even there, Hayes protested. He's basing his report on second-hand information. Actually, he was there for the landing, and he's been reviewing the radio communications from the entire mission, Anderson replied. Which brings me to Sergeant Martinez's report. The colonel's expression grew more serious as he read the crew chief's assessment. Morgan's the best pilot I've ever worked with, period. She belongs in the cockpit, not the maintenance hangar. This woman saved lives today while qualified pilots sat on the ground debating regulations. Ava watched Hayes' face cycle through confusion, anger, and growing desperation. This wasn't how the inquiry was supposed to go. She was supposed to be crucified, not commended. Sir, Hayes said, leaning forward in his chair, these reports are clearly biased. The wounded soldiers are grateful, naturally, but that doesn't change the fact that Morgan violated direct orders and military protocol. Protocol, Anderson repeated, his tone thoughtful. Tell me, Captain Hayes, what does protocol say about responding to emergency situations when standard procedures have failed? Hayes opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The regulations were clear. In emergency situations, personnel were expected to take initiative to save lives and complete the mission. Furthermore, Anderson continued, I've reviewed Morgan's personnel file thoroughly. A red flag for insubordination stems from an incident where she attempted to warn you about faulty equipment that subsequently caused a near-fatal accident. Is that correct? That's not how it happened, Hayes stammered. According to the maintenance logs, Morgan identified the altimeter calibration error and attempted to brief you on the safety concern. You dismissed her warning and proceeded with the flight. The subsequent near crash was caused by exactly the equipment failure she'd identified. The room fell silent. Ava could hear her own heartbeat as Anderson continued his review of the case. "It seems to me," the colonel said, slowly, "that we have a pattern here. A highly skilled aviator repeatedly attempting to prevent disasters, repeatedly ignored by command, and finally taking direct action to save lives when the system failed." Hayes was sweating now, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Sir, regulations exist for a reason. We can't have personnel taking matters into their own hands whenever they disagree with command decisions." "No," Anderson agreed. "But we also can't have command decisions that cost lives due to pride, prejudice, or simple stupidity." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ava realized that something had shifted in the room. The inquiry was no longer about her. The violations, it was about the system that had created the situation in the first place. "I'll be reviewing this case for another 48 hours, Anderson announced. "Morgan, you're confined to quarters pending final decision. Hayes, I want a complete review of Morgan's grounding and the circumstances surrounding her transfer to maintenance duty." As they filed out of the conference room, Hayes shot Ava a look that could have melted steel. She'd embarrassed him, exposed his failures, and now threatened his career. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't fighting it alone. The knock on Ava's quarters door came at 1900 hours, 47 hours after the inquiry began. She'd spent 2 days in isolation, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she'd save 4 lives only to destroy her own career. The uncertainty was eating her alive. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Colonel Anderson with her final judgment. Instead, Captain Rodriguez stepped through the doorway, followed by Sergeant Martinez and 2 people she didn't recognize. A woman in civilian clothes carrying a briefcase, and a stern-faced man in dress uniform with enough ribbons to outfit a small army. "Morgan," Rodriguez said, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." Ava stood at attention, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sir." "At ease," the decorated officer said, extending his hand. "I'm General Patricia Williams, Deputy Commander of Air Force Special Operations. This is Janet Foster from the Inspector General's office." Ava's knees nearly buckled. The Inspector General's office only got involved when something was seriously wrong, either with her or with the system that had created this situation. "General Williams," she managed, shaking the offered hand. "Sit down, Morgan. We've got a lot to discuss." Foster opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Over the past 48 hours, we've been conducting a comprehensive review of your case. What we've found is disturbing. The inquiry into your unauthorized flight revealed some significant irregularities in your treatment over the past 3 years," General Williams continued. "Irregularities that suggest a pattern of discrimination and abuse of authority." Ava's pulse quickened. "I don't understand." "Captain Hayes," Foster said, consulting her notes, "has been instrumental in blocking your advancement despite consistently excellent performance reviews and technical proficiency scores. He's also been spreading information about your attitude problems to other officers, effectively blacklisting you from flight opportunities." "But that's not the worst part," Rodriguez interjected, his voice tight with anger. "Tell her about the flight hours." Foster turned to a new page in her folder. "According to official records, you've been denied access to required flight training hours necessary for maintaining your certification. This appears to be a deliberate attempt to ensure you'd never qualify for active duty, even if the insubordination flag was removed." "That's illegal," Ava whispered. "Yes, it is," General Williams confirmed. "But it gets worse. We've discovered that Hayes has been falsifying maintenance reports, claiming aircraft were flight-ready when they weren't, and overriding your safety recommendations without proper documentation. Ava felt the room spinning around her. The altimeter incident wasn't the first time? Not even close, Martinez said grimly. I've been keeping unofficial records of every time you identified problems that Hayes ignored. 17 incidents in the past 3 years, Morgan. 17 times you prevented accidents, equipment failures, or safety violations. And 17 times Hayes covered it up to protect his own reputation, Foster added. We've got documentation, witness statements, and maintenance logs that paint a very clear picture of systematic harassment and endangerment of military personnel. General Williams leaned forward in her chair. Morgan, we believe Hayes has been using his position to punish you for making him look incompetent. Every time you demonstrated superior knowledge or skill, he found a way to marginalize you further. But why? Ava asked. Why would he risk lives just to keep me grounded? Pride, Rodriguez said simply. You saved his life, and he couldn't handle being shown up by someone he considered beneath him. So he made sure you'd never get the chance to prove yourself again. Until you did exactly that, Foster continued. Your rescue mission not only saved 4 lives, it exposed 3 years of institutional failures. Hayes overplayed his hand trying to destroy your career, and now he's facing court-martial for abuse of authority, falsifying military records, and endangering personnel. Ava sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what she was hearing. The system hadn't just failed her, it had been actively working against her, led by a man whose ego couldn't accept that she was better than him. There's more, General, Williams said. We've reviewed your flight school records, your technical certifications, and your performance during the rescue mission. You're not just qualified for active duty, Morgan. You're exceptional. Which is why I'm here to offer you a choice, Foster said, pulling out another document. Full reinstatement to active flight status with back pay and rank adjustment, plus assignment to our Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Or, if you prefer, we can arrange a transfer to any base in the Air Force with a formal commendation and guaranteed flight training opportunities. Ava stared at the papers in Foster's hands, hardly believing what she was hearing. 3 years of being told she wasn't good enough, wasn't trustworthy, wasn't qualified, and now they were offering her everything she'd ever wanted. What about Hayes? She asked. Captain Hayes is being relieved of duty pending court-martial proceedings, General Williams said. He'll face charges of abuse of authority, falsifying military records, and criminal negligence. If convicted, he'll be dishonorably discharged and face possible prison time. And the other officers who went along with it? Under investigation, Foster replied. Anyone who participated in or enabled the harassment will face appropriate consequences. Rodriguez stood up and extended his hand. Morgan, I want you to know that there were people who knew what was happening. We should have done more to stop it. We should have stood up for you. You stood up for me when it mattered most, Ava replied, shaking his hand. That's what counts. General Williams handed her the transfer orders. Take your time deciding. You've earned the right to choose your own path. As they prepared to leave, Martinez paused at the door. For what it's worth, Morgan, you're the finest pilot I've ever worked with. The sky's been waiting for you. Alone in her quarters, Ava held the papers that would change her life. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, eager, confident, ready to take on the world. They'd tried to break her, tried to convince her she wasn't good enough, tried to steal her dreams. But she'd kept training, kept believing, kept fighting. And now, finally, justice had found its way to her door. The choice was easy. She belonged in the sky, and she was never coming down. The court-martial proceedings began on a crisp Monday morning in October, held in the base's main conference hall that had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. Ava sat in the witness section, her dress uniform crisp and her posture straight. watching as Captain Bradley Hayes entered flanked by his defense attorney and a look of barely concealed panic. 3 months had passed since the rescue mission. That changed everything. 3 months of investigation, documentation, and testimony from dozens of witnesses who'd finally found the courage to speak up. Hayes had gone from respected officer to pariah in record time, his career crumbling under the weight of evidence against him. "All rise," the bailiff called. Court is now in session, Colonel Patricia Morrison presiding. The charges were read aloud, each one more damning than the last. Abuse of authority, falsifying military records, criminal negligence, harassment of subordinate personnel, endangering military operations. The list went on for several minutes, painting a picture of systematic corruption that had endangered lives and destroyed careers. Hayes's attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Janet Richardson, rose to address the court. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence of all charges. Captain Hayes is a decorated officer with 15 years of exemplary service. The prosecution's case is based on hearsay and the testimony of disgruntled personnel seeking revenge. The prosecution may present its opening statement," Colonel Morrison replied. Major Thomas Fletcher, the prosecuting attorney, stood and approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about abuse of power in its most insidious form. Captain Hayes used his position to systematically destroy the career of a highly skilled pilot because his pride couldn't accept that she was better than him." Fletcher gestured toward Ava. "Sergeant Morgan saved Captain Hayes's life 3 years ago by identifying a critical equipment failure he'd missed. Instead of gratitude, he branded her insubordinate and launched a campaign of harassment that put countless lives at risk. The evidence will show that Captain Hayes falsified maintenance reports, denied required training opportunities, and spread false information about Sergeant Morgan's competence. He turned her into a pariah to protect his own reputation, and 4 soldiers nearly died because of his actions." The first witness called was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, still bearing scars from the shrapnel that had nearly killed him in Devil's Canyon. He walked to the witness stand with a slight limp, his Purple Heart ribbon visible on his dress uniform. "Sergeant Torres," Fletcher began, "please describe the events of the rescue mission." Torres looked directly at Hayes as he spoke. "We were pinned down, taking heavy fire, bleeding in the sand. Our regular pilots were unavailable, and command was debating regulations while we were dying. Then this bird comes out of nowhere, flying like something out of a movie. Did you know who was piloting the aircraft? Not at first. But when we got back to base, we found out it was Sergeant Morgan, the woman they'd kept in the maintenance hangar for 3 years while lesser pilots flew missions." Hayes's face reddened, but he remained silent. "In your opinion, how would you rate the pilot's performance during the rescue?" "Best flying I've ever seen," Torres replied without hesitation. "Perfect control under fire, flawless approach and extraction, professional communication throughout. She saved our lives." Richardson rose for cross-examination. "Sergeant Torres, you were injured and under extreme stress during this incident. Is it possible your perception of events was affected by these circumstances?" Torres's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I've been flying combat missions for 8 years. I know good flying when I see it, and I know what it means to be saved by someone who's been treated like garbage for doing her job too well." The testimony continued for 3 days. Sergeant Martinez described the maintenance issues Hayes had ignored. Captain Rodriguez detailed the pattern of harassment he'd witnessed. Corporal Jennifer Hayes, recovered from her shoulder wound, testified about the rescue mission and Morgan's exceptional skill. But the most damaging testimony came from Technical Sergeant David Park, who'd worked in the maintenance records office. "Captain Hayes ordered me to alter maintenance reports on 17 separate occasions," Park testified, his voice shaking. He wanted to remove any mention of safety concerns identified by Sergeant Morgan, and he wanted to downgrade her performance evaluations. "Did you comply with these orders?" Fletcher asked. "Initially, yes. I thought he had legitimate reasons. But after the third or fourth time, I started keeping copies of the original reports." Fletcher approached the witness stand with a box of documents. "Are these the original reports you preserved?" "Yes, sir. Everyone shows that Sergeant Morgan identified critical safety issues that Captain Hayes chose to ignore or cover up." The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Hayes hadn't just harassed one soldier. He'd endangered the entire base by ignoring safety protocols to protect his ego. When it came time for Hayes to testify in his own defense, he took the stand with the arrogance that had defined his career. Richardson led him through his service record, highlighting his commendations and achievements. "Captain Hayes," she said, "how do you respond to the allegations that you systematically harassed Sergeant Morgan?" "I maintained appropriate military discipline," Hayes replied. "Morgan was insubordinate, unreliable, and had an attitude problem. I made command decisions based on the safety and effectiveness of my unit." "And the maintenance reports? Did you order alterations to official documents?" "I ordered corrections to inaccurate reports filed by an overzealous mechanic who overstepped her authority." Fletcher rose for cross-examination, and his first question cut to the heart of the matter. "Captain Hayes, how many soldiers would have died if Sergeant Morgan hadn't ignored your authority and flown that rescue mission?" Hayes' attorney objected, but the damage was done. The question hung in the air like an accusation. "I'll rephrase," Fletcher continued. "In your opinion, what would have happened to Recon Team Alpha if no rescue had been attempted?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "That's speculation." "Is it? You had no pilots available, no alternative rescue plan, and 4 soldiers bleeding in a combat zone. What was your solution?" We would have found another way." "In 30 minutes, while they were under fire?" Hayes had no answer. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty on all charges. Colonel Morrison looked down at Hayes with an expression of disgust. "Captain Hayes, you have betrayed everything this uniform represents. You put your pride above the lives of the soldiers under your command, and you nearly cost 4 good men their lives. This court sentences you to dismissal from service with loss of all pay and benefits, reduction to the rank of private, and 18 months in military prison. You will also forfeit your pension and veterans' benefits." Hayes slumped in his chair as the gavel fell, his career and reputation destroyed by the same arrogance that had nearly killed him 3 years earlier. As the military police led him away, he looked back at Ava one final time. She met his gaze steadily, feeling neither satisfaction nor pity, only the quiet justice of truth finally acknowledged. "Sergeant Morgan," Colonel Morrison called out, "please approach the bench." Ava stood and walked forward, her heart pounding with uncertainty. Even with Hayes convicted, she wasn't sure what came next. 3 years ago, this institution failed you," Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of official acknowledgement. "We allowed personal prejudice to override merit, politics to trump competence. Today, we begin to make that right." She lifted a document from her desk. "By order of the Secretary of the Air Force, you are hereby promoted to the rank of captain and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional heroism in aerial combat. Your red flag has been expunged and you are authorized for immediate assignment to any aviation unit of your choosing." The courtroom erupted in applause as Ava accepted the promotion documents with hands that trembled slightly. 3 years of vindication condensed into a single moment of recognition. But as she looked out at the faces in the crowd, soldiers who'd watched her struggle, mechanics who'd seen her dedication, pilots who'd finally witnessed her skill, she realized the real victory wasn't the promotion or the medal. It was the knowledge that truth, no matter how long suppressed, always finds a way to rise. 6 months after Hayes' conviction, Captain Ava Morgan stood on the flight line at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, watching the sun paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. Her new assignment with the 5th Special Operations Squadron had exceeded every expectation she dared to harbor during those dark years in the maintenance hangar. Captain Morgan, Lieutenant Sarah Collins called out, jogging across the tarmac with a clipboard in hand. Final pre-flight briefing for Operation Desert Shield in 5 minutes. Ava nodded, adjusting her flight helmet under her arm. Collins was one of the new pilots assigned to her unit, fresh out of flight school with the kind of enthusiasm and respect that Ava had forgotten was possible. The younger woman looked at her not as an anomaly or a problem to be managed, but as the seasoned combat pilot she'd finally been allowed to become. Copy that, Collins. How's the weather looking for our route? Clear skies, minimal wind. Perfect conditions for the extraction exercise. The irony wasn't lost on Ava. She'd gone from being denied simple training flights to leading complex special operations missions. The military had a way of overcorrecting when it finally acknowledged its mistakes, and her rapid advancement reflected both her exceptional skills and institution's desire to prove it had learned from the Hayes incident. Captain, came another voice behind her. Master Sergeant Jennifer Lopez, her new crew chief, approached with the confident stride of someone who'd worked with the best pilots in the Air Force. Birds ready for flight. All systems green, fuel topped off, medical equipment secured. Outstanding. Any concerns? None whatsoever, Lopez replied. I've reviewed your maintenance logs from Grayson. Your attention to detail is legendary among the crew chiefs. We know when you sign off on an aircraft, it's ready to fly. The compliment hit differently than the patronizing praise she'd received in her maintenance days. This was professional recognition between equals, acknowledgement of competence rather than consolation for limitation. Colonel Williams wants to see you before takeoff, Lopez added. Said it was important. Ava found General Williams in the Operations Center, studying weather reports and mission parameters on multiple screens. The general had been instrumental in her transfer and promotion, ensuring she received the opportunities she'd been denied for so long. Morgan, Williams said, without looking up. How are you settling into the new assignment? Better than I ever imagined possible, ma'am. The team is exceptional, the missions are challenging, and the equipment is top tier. Good, because I have news that might interest you. Williams turned to face her, holding a classified folder. We've received a request from the Pentagon for our best pilot to lead a joint training exercise with British Special Air Service. High-profile mission, international visibility, career-defining opportunity. Ava's pulse quickened. And the request specifically asks for the pilot who executed the Devil's Canyon rescue. Apparently, word of your flying has reached some very high places. The folder contained details of a complex multinational exercise involving helicopter insertions in hostile terrain, coordination with ground forces, and extraction under simulated combat conditions. It was exactly the kind of mission that would have been considered impossible for her just a year ago. Ma'am, I'm honored, but I have to ask, is this assignment based on my current capabilities? Or is it another attempt to make up for past mistakes? Williams smiled, the first time Ava had seen genuine amusement in the general's expression. Morgan, let me be clear about something. Your rescue mission was exceptional flying under impossible circumstances. Your subsequent performance has been flawless. This assignment isn't charity. It's recognition of excellence. The Hayes situation taught us that talent doesn't care about politics, and competence doesn't respect prejudice. You've proven yourself beyond any doubt, and now you're getting the opportunities you should have had from the beginning. As Ava prepared for her evening mission, she reflected on how completely her world had changed. The same skills that had been dismissed as mechanics knowledge were now valued as pilot expertise. The attention to detail that had been criticized as obsessive was now praised as professional excellence. The confidence that had been labeled insubordination was now recognized as leadership potential. "Captain Morgan," came a voice over the intercom. "Tower to Special Ops 77. You're cleared for takeoff. Winds calm, visibility unlimited. Roger, Tower. Special Ops 77 requesting departure to the south." As her aircraft lifted off into the Arizona evening, Ava felt the familiar rush of flight that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her career. But now it was accompanied by something she'd never experienced before: the absolute certainty that she belonged exactly where she was. The desert stretched endlessly below, painted in twilight colors that reminded her of that morning 6 months ago when she'd first defied orders to save lives. She'd risen from the maintenance hangar to the cockpit, from pariah to leader, from the woman they wouldn't let fly to the pilot they couldn't fly without. "Special Ops 77, this is base," crackled through her headset. "Mission parameters updated. You're cleared to proceed to Exercise Area Bravo for advanced tactical training." "Copy that, base. 77 proceeding to Bravo." As she banked toward the training area, Ava smiled behind her oxygen mask. The sky had always been her home. Now, finally, everyone else knew it too. 2 years after the court-martial that ended Bradley Hayes' career, Captain Ava Morgan stood before a formation of newly graduated flight school cadets at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as she prepared to deliver the keynote address for their commissioning ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of families, officers, and fresh-faced pilots. "When I was your age, someone told me I didn't belong in the cockpit. Ground crew at best," they said. "Some of you will face similar doubts, similar obstacles, similar moments when the system tells you that your dreams don't align with their expectations." In the front row, she spotted Lieutenant Sarah Collins, now a seasoned pilot in her own right, nodding with understanding. Behind her sat Master Sergeant Lopez, Colonel Williams, and Captain Rodriguez, the people who'd helped transform her from an outcast mechanic into the pilot standing before them today. "Excellence doesn't negotiate," Ava continued. "It doesn't compromise, it doesn't make excuses, and it doesn't accept limitations imposed by others. When you know you're right, when you know you're capable, when you know you belong somewhere, you keep training, keep believing, keep fighting until the world catches up with your vision of yourself." She paused, looking out at the eager faces before her. Some would face the same prejudices she'd overcome. Others would encounter different obstacles, different forms of institutional resistance. But all of them needed to understand that competence ultimately trumps politics, that skill transcends bias, that courage speaks louder than doubt. 3 years ago, I was cleaning bolt housings in a maintenance hangar while watching others fly missions I could have executed better. Today, I lead special operations for the most elite aviation unit in the Air Force. The difference wasn't my capabilities. Those remained constant. The difference was an emergency that finally forced the system to acknowledge what had always been true. General Patricia Williams, now promoted to 3 stars, sat in the distinguished visitor section with a slight smile. She'd become a mentor and advocate, ensuring that the lessons learned from Ava's experience were institutionalized across the Air Force. New policies protected whistleblowers, required documentation of training denials, and established oversight for personnel decisions. "Don't wait for an emergency to prove your worth," Ava advised the cadets. Excellence in small things prepares you for excellence in great moments. Every maintenance check I performed with obsessive attention to detail prepared me for the precision required in combat flying. Every simulator session I ran while others slept gave me the muscle memory that saved lives when it mattered most. She thought about Hayes, now serving his prison sentence and facing a civilian world that wanted nothing to do with a dishonorably discharged officer. His downfall had been complete and absolute, but it hadn't brought her satisfaction. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring the system worked for everyone. Some of you will face supervisors who feel threatened by your competence. Some will encounter institutional biases that seem insurmountable. Some will be told that your lane is narrower than your capabilities. When that happens, remember that every system is run by people, and people can change their minds when presented with undeniable evidence. In the audience, she spotted Sergeant Michael Torres, now fully recovered from his wounds and serving as an instructor at the base. He caught her eye and gave a small salute, a gesture of respect between warriors who'd shared fire together. The helicopter that lifted me out of the maintenance hangar wasn't just carrying me to a rescue mission. It was carrying me toward the person I'd always been, the pilot I'd trained to become, the leader I was meant to be. Your moment will come. When it does, be ready. As the ceremony concluded and the new pilots tossed their caps into the Texas sky, Ava felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with personal vindication. The real victory wasn't her promotion or Hayes' punishment. It was the knowledge that her experience had changed things for others. Young pilots would still face obstacles, but they'd also inherit a system slightly more willing to recognize merit over prejudice. The policies implemented after the Hayes investigation had already protected 3 other pilots from similar harassment, and the precedent of her case had emboldened others to speak up when they witnessed injustice. Captain Morgan came a familiar voice behind her. Captain Rodriguez, now a full colonel, approached with the easy confidence of someone who'd always supported the right side. Excellent speech. Those kids needed to hear that. They needed to hear that the system can change. She replied, that persistence and competence eventually overcome politics and prejudice. Speaking of which, Rodriguez continued, I have news. The Pentagon has approved your request for the Advanced Combat Leadership Program. If you complete it successfully, you'll be eligible for Squadron Command within 2 years. Squadron Command, leading an entire unit of pilots responsible for training, missions, and the careers of dozens of aviators. It was the opportunity she dreamed of during those early morning simulator sessions, the position that would have been inconceivable when she was tightening bolts in Hangar 7. Colonel, she said, I accept. As the commissioning ceremony wound down and families gathered around their newly minted pilots, Ava walked toward the flight line where her current aircraft waited. A U-60 Blackhawk, identical to the one she'd commandeered for the Devil's Canyon rescue, sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. She ran her hand along the aircraft's nose, feeling the smooth metal that had carried her through dozens of successful missions. This helicopter had taken her to places she'd never imagined, not just geographical locations, but professional heights that had seemed impossible from the maintenance hangar. Ready for the afternoon training flight, Captain? Lieutenant Collins asked, approaching with her flight gear. Always ready, Ava replied, climbing into the pilot's seat that no longer felt like a privilege but like home. As the rotors spun up and the familiar vibration filled her bones, she thought about the long journey from pariah to leader, from the woman they wouldn't let fly to the pilot they'd made a poster child for institutional change. The desert stretched out before her, unchanged and eternal. The same landscape where she'd first defied orders to save lives. But everything else had transformed. She'd found her place in the sky, earned the respect of her peers, and helped create a system slightly more just than the one that had tried to destroy her. The radio crackled with clearance for takeoff, and Ava lifted the aircraft into the limitless blue above. She'd always belonged here, in the cockpit, in command, in the sky. That had called to her since childhood. Now everyone else knew it too. The woman they'd refused to trust with wings had become the pilot they couldn't imagine flying without. And somewhere in the vast expanse above Texas, justice and dreams converged in the rotor wash of a helicopter, carrying someone who'd never stopped believing she belonged exactly where she was. The sky had always been hers. She just had to prove it to everyone else. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.